Welcome to NHL Quick Hits. I'm David Crosby here with Steele Roden, and it's great to finally have hockey back. It's been an interesting first week, and on today's show, we're going to discuss some surprising starts, both good and bad, for a bunch of teams and players in the league. But first, we're going to start out with a segment that we hope to do each week. Steele and I are going to share our picks for the best potential free agent or waiver ads in your fantasy hockey leagues. Now, we are recording this episode on Sunday, October 16th. We're going to highlight players in different tiers who should be available in your league. So we're not going to talk about any players who are owned in more than 50% of leagues. So if there are some of those players on your waiver wire or your free agent wire, take a look and see maybe why they're not owned in yours, because they're not going to be covered here today. So first off, we're going to start with players owned in 50% or less. The next tier will be 30% or less. And we're going to finish for managers who are in really deep leagues or maybe even keeper leagues. We'll finish with players owned in 10% or less of their leagues. So they should be widely available. Now, it's absolutely crucial to have players ready to add on your watch list. So even if you're not looking to add a player right away, maybe take a look, add them to your watch list so you're ready to pull the trigger on them when you need them. Owners of Max Pacioretty got some bad news this week. He is week to week with a foot fracture, and he could actually miss up to 6 weeks, which is a huge hit for Vegas. Consensus top 5 pick Nikita Kucherov is also being evaluated after getting hurt in the third period of Saturday's game against Washington. So, Steele, starting with players owned in less than half of fantasy leagues right now, who are you targeting heading into week 2?
Yeah, for 50% or less on the as a free agent, I'm looking at Bowen Byram of the Colorado Avalanche. I think he's played really good for the first 2 games, 2 points in 19 games last season with the Colorado Avalanche. He's already got 2 points in 2 games this season. He's 17.60 points in fantasy league for the Yahoo fantasy league. So I think he's done a tremendous job so far in the first 2 games. He's not the type of guy that's going to lay a ton of hits or get a lot of blocks for you, but I think he's shown a lot of potential that he can step up and be a crucial part for the Colorado Avalanche on the blue line. So if you're lacking some defense with the way you may have drafted, lacking some defense instead of those players up front, I think a guy like Bowen Byram is a crucial guy that you can probably pick up for a free agent.
It's a little bit early for me to be taking Byram outside of dynasty leagues right now, but I did take a look at kind of a few clips of how he's been playing, some highlights of the Avalanche games. I did catch a little bit of one live there as well, and he's been playing really well. I think if he gets an opportunity to play more minutes, he was pretty sheltered last season. I think you're right. He could put up some nice offensive numbers, and he's definitely a guy to watch. And defense, for sure, are pretty scarce out there. So if you get somebody who's got a nice offensive ceiling on the back end, that's definitely a guy worth targeting. For me, I'm going with Jeff Carter of the Pittsburgh Penguins. With Evgeny Malkin expected to miss another 2.5 months, Carter is going to be the biggest beneficiary of those extra opportunities. Sidney Crosby, of course, has also been out, so Carter has been centering the first line, but he's got a top 6 role locked up no matter what. What I really like is he can play that center or right wing. Having that dual eligibility really helps in fantasy as well. He's got a guaranteed spot on the power play, and he's proven that he can produce. He has 4 points, 9 shots, 6 hits, and 3 blocks in his first 3 games this season. But it's not just this year. He now has 20 points in 23 games with the Penguins, dating back to last season's trade. So there is one little bit of maybe something that will hold you back from adding him right away. And that's that the Penguins only play 2 games in week 2. So you might be able to wait until the weekend to add him and cycle through a few more ads early on in the week, kind of get your starts up before you get to that Thursday, Friday. But if you don't want to miss out on him, I would recommend adding him immediately. I definitely did that in a league myself this week. So let's move on to players owned in 30% or fewer leagues. Steele, who do you got?
Again, for 30% or less, I'm sticking with a defenseman here. And if your team, again, if you're lacking defenseman, I think a guy like Erik Cernak is suitable for your team. He's already got 29.10 fantasy points this season, and you'll get all of your fantasy points from Cernak by his hits and his blocks. He gets a ton of them, and especially in this long 82-game season, returning back to the regular format that we've seen over for a long time. he's going to get a ton of those hits. And as well, his points have gone up over the last couple of years. So for a guy like Erik Cernak, if one of your defensemen got injured, or again, you're lacking in that area, I think a guy like Erik Cernak would be really beneficial for your team.
I like that target a lot. And what I like about players who constantly put up blocks and hits, especially ones who are on good teams like Cernak is, those blocks and hits are really consistent. Like you said, they're going to come every single game, and you might just get lucky and get them on a run with some points as well, maybe getting some secondary assists in a really nice offense. I also went with a defender in this choice, and that was Moritz Seider at 21%. He was Detroit's 6th overall pick in the 2019 draft. He should already be owned in every dynasty league. So if he isn't in yours, add him right now. Even in standard leagues, I think his ownership is going to skyrocket, and for good reason. In his first 2 NHL games, Seider has 3 assists, 1 on the power play, 3 hits, and a block. He's already averaging nearly 22 minutes per night as a 20-year-old, and he's on the second defensive pairing and second power play. I think he has a chance to move up to that top pairing, not only in regular minutes, but also on that top power play. He was close to a half point per game in the past 2 seasons, which was split between the AHL and the Swedish Hockey League. So he's proven he's a good offensive defenseman. If you can get 1 point every 2 games out of a D-man, you're laughing, especially for a guy who's 20 years old. Now, what I really like about his potential upside, even though he doesn't have huge blocks or hits numbers in those first 2 games, he's feisty. He's 6'4". He's 203 pounds. He's got some attitude and physicality. There was a clip going around the internet in Detroit's season opener. Seider actually stole the puck from Victor Hedman after a whistle, started a little bit of a shoving match, and he seemed to love being right in the middle of it. I love guys like this. He seems to want that physicality. So I think on top of his offensive potential, I could see him having more than 100 hits and 50 blocks by the time this season ends. And week 2 is a really good opportunity for you to take a flyer on somebody like Seider. Detroit is one of only 5 teams that plays 4 games this week, and they have a really easy schedule. Columbus, Calgary, Montreal, and Chicago. Those teams are a combined 2-7-1 this season. You'll notice I talk about how many games played teams have each week. That is one tool you really want to use when you're looking at adding a guy. Even if it's just for the short term, you want even a guy who's maybe a mediocre talent, him playing 4 times a week might be better than a premier talent playing twice a week. Let's go to some sleeper, Steele. Let's get your first guy owned in 15% or less of fantasy leagues.
Yeah, for my first guy, it's got to be Dustin Brown. He's under 15% in all of the leagues all over the world. He's already recorded 25.30 fantasy points so far this year. And he's like Brendan Gallagher's older brother. They're pretty much the exact same player. He's just a little bit older than Brendan Gallagher, but he's the exact same type of player. He's a pest to play against. He works hard, he lays the body, and he loves to park himself in front of the net and disturb the peace for the goaltenders and the defensemen. So I love a guy like Dustin Brown. He brings a lot of value for some of your bottom end forwards for your fantasy team. And again, he's been phenomenal this year. He's got 3 points so far on the season in the first 2 games that he's played. I think he's done a phenomenal job so far. And like I said, he brings a lot of physicality, and he's not afraid to get put his body in front of the line, in front of the puck. So a guy like Dustin Brown is a tremendous pickup for your fantasy team.
Dustin Brown's a guy I use as a streamer every single year. He's really consistent with those hits. He puts up some points here and there, and he's on a really good line. So I like that pick a lot. I'm going with Michael Bunting, who is 10% owned, the 26-year-old left winger. He's a bit of a late bloomer. Maybe he wasn't taken too seriously in drafts after scoring 13 points in 21 games for the Coyotes last season. And that's probably because he had 10 goals on a really high shooting percentage that, frankly, is just not going to last. But I think he is worth taking a chance on. He was just less than a point per game in his last 2 seasons in the AHL. And that can be a really good indicator of the type of offense some players might be able to produce at the NHL level. He's also playing with the best line mates of his career this season in Toronto. He's currently on the second forward line and second power play lines. Once Austin Matthews comes back, which is expected to happen next game for the Leafs, He'll be playing with John Tavares and William Nylander on that second line. And I actually think that he has a chance to supplant Nick Ritchie on that top line and potentially play with Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner. As of now, Ritchie is scoreless, and Bunting has a goal and an assist, including one with the man advantage in the first 3 games of the season. Steele, let's get your second target.
Yeah, with my second target, I'm going back to the defenseman over here, Rasmus Sandin of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Another fellow player that has really grown into this position that the Maple Leafs were really looking forward to him getting into the lineup. He's got 23.30 fantasy points on the season so far. I have loved the way he's played so far in the first 3 games for the Toronto Maple Leafs. He looks way more poised with the puck, way more mature with it. He's not panicking when it gets to the stick and when he gets it back from his partner on the blue line in the offensive zone like we've seen him in the past. So I think, again, if you're lacking in that department with the defenseman, a guy like Rasmus Sandin, he's shown a lot of potential so far in these first 3 games. I think he's going to get a lot more playing time than we expect so far this season. So, again, Rasmus Sandin for me, under 15%.
I love that pick, Steele. And I think with Morgan Rielly being a pending free agent, maybe the Leafs are going to want to give him some more run, see what Sandin can do on the power play, see if he's the type of guy that can maybe log more minutes if they're not able to extend Morgan Rielly after this year. I'm going to go with Mason McTavish, who is 9% owned, the Anaheim Ducks' 3rd overall pick in this year's NHL draft, had a goal and assist in his NHL debut. And while he was pointless in his second game, I think there's a lot to like here. He's currently on the 3rd line, but Adam Henrique occupies the left side on that first line. He's 31 years old, and he's not in the Ducks' long-term plans. Max Comtois, he's been given the first crack on the left side on that top line, top power play unit. So far, he's scoreless in 2 games. McTavish is averaging 14.5 minutes per game. If he gets a bigger chance, which I think he could with Anaheim, focusing on their youth in what should be a rebuilding year, he could potentially push for 45, 50 points with some power play production in there. So just be prepared that the Ducks may choose to send him down to the minors in the next couple of weeks. He might be the kind of guy that you're dropping a week from now, but this week, Anaheim also has 4 games on their slate. So I really think he could put up some points for you this week. Steele, let's get your last player, 15% or less owned.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the Ottawa Senators goaltender here, Anton Forsberg. And if you're looking to pick up a goalie, I think Anton Forsberg would be a tremendous pickup for you. With Matt Murray being out of the lineup, he's going to get a lot more playing time. He's played incredible in the first 2 games against the Toronto Maple Leafs, winning the first one 3-2, and then losing the second one 3-1 last night. So I think a guy like Anton Forsberg, if you're lacking in the goalie department right now, if he's injured or your 2 starting goaltenders just aren't playing that well, you got to look to Anton Forsberg because he has shown incredible potential.
I like that pick a lot too, Steele. And I think you're going to like my last pick as well. It's Marcus Foligno of the Minnesota Wild. He is a player that I've kept tabs on for quite a long time just because of his physical style. Now, I avoided him this year in drafts because I thought he was in line for a big regression. He had a career best 25% shooting percentage last year, which helped him score 26 points in 39 games. His shooting percentage is usually half that. But this year, Foligno has a great chance to produce fantasy relevant numbers again on the Wild second line and second power play. If you're in a banger league that includes hits and penalty minutes, he's a really sneaky ad. He plays 3 times each of the next 4 weeks and 4 times in week 6. So you're going to get a ton of starts from this guy over the next month and change. He should offer consistent production until the end of November. And he's the type of player that I would be looking for as a substitution for a guy like Max Pacioretty. That's going to do it for that section of the fantasy. But we're going to talk about some more fantasy players who are probably already owned in your leagues and maybe whether you should target them in trades or if they're already on your team, if you can expect their production to continue. So we're going to call this segment early overreactions in both fantasy and the league. I mean, hot or cold starts can be blown out of proportion with those small sample sizes. Sometimes it's the start of a season-long trend. Other times it's just a blip before they return back to the norm. So we're going to dive into some teams shortly, but let's stick with players here for a minute. Steele, do you buy or sell the fast start of Detroit winger Tyler Bertuzzi? He was passed on in a lot of drafts, likely in some part because of his vaccination status, some worry that he's going to miss some games this year. But he was one of the top free agent ads in week 1 in fantasy leagues after his 4-goal explosion in the Wings season opener. In his first 2 games, he also has an assist, a power play point, 3 hits, 3 blocks, 6 shots, and 4 penalty minutes. So pretty much production across the board. Do you think Bertuzzi was being overlooked in the draft, or do you just think this is an overreaction by fantasy managers in a rush to add him after that one big game?
I think he was overlooked in the draft. And the funny thing is he's only owned by 47% of the league across the world. So that's a really shocking thing to see right there. But again, I think you're right. I think people were really unsure and afraid of Bertuzzi because of his unvaccination leading into the season, which again, he's not allowed to play in Canada because of the unvaccination, which he's probably going to miss 15 to 20 games because of that. So that's a lot of games that he's going to be missing because of his unvaccination. But without that, there's no question that he's a talented player and one of the best players on the Detroit Red Wings. Over the last 2 years, he's recorded 95 points from 2018 to 2020. He's been a stellar player for the Red Wings, no questions about it. It's just unfortunate prior to the season beginning, he was unvaccinated, and because of that, he's not allowed to play in Canada on the away game. So because of that, I think people were just really afraid. But he's such a talented player that I was really shocked that he's less than 50% owned in Yahoo fantasy leagues.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to stay much longer. And he kind of reminds me of a smaller Brady Tkachuk. Their styles are really similar. I also don't think that it helped. He missed a ton of time last year with injuries. Maybe fantasy managers kind of forgot about him this year. Let's go to a guy that is never forgotten in fantasy drafts. Alex Ovechkin went from questionable to play with some injuries there to start the season to potentially winning some matchups for owners all by himself this week. He had 2 goals and 2 assists, including 3 power play points in his first game alone, and then another goal and 2 hits in his second game. So, Steele, was Ovechkin drafted too low at his ADP of 11.4? And do you think he should be the Rocket Richard favorite this season? Right now, he's 4th in odds behind Austin Matthews, Connor McDavid, and Leon Draisaitl.
Looking at it now, I think he might have been drafted too low. I actually did end up drafting Alex Ovechkin with my 6th pick in the league that I am, and he's been absolutely incredible. Like you said, 3 goals, 2 assists in the first 2 games, 45.90 fantasy points for Alex Ovechkin so far this year. That's why he's just so good. He scores a lot, and he's able to use his weight and lay the hits out too, and he's not afraid to block the shots as well. So he brings all of the value in fantasy leagues into fantasy points into your fantasy team, and he's an incredible player to have on your fantasy league. And the thing is too, you get most of your fantasy points by shooting the puck and scoring goals. This guy shoots and this guy scores all the time. So I think right there, it just shows what an incredible asset he is for your team. And looking at it now, I think he was drafted a little too low for the ADP at 11.4.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Steele. And I think that maybe his low assist totals the past 2 seasons probably scared some people off from picking him around the range that you did. But the goals, the hits, the power play points, they've always been there. So if Ovechkin can get that assist total back up to where he was a couple years before, where he was consistently putting up 30-some assists every single year, he could easily finish in the top 10, maybe even the top 5 of fantasy scoring. As far as the Rocket Richard odds, I mean, I took a look at this. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Ovechkin could finish first, but I think the 4th spot is probably the right spot for him there as well. And a quick shout out to Evgeny Kuznetsov, who I absolutely trashed in fantasy draft previews this year. And then he goes ahead and takes advantage of Nicholas Backstrom missing these first few games, and likely a couple more weeks after this. Kuznetsov looking good early in league, so I guess he can't win them all. Steele. Let's move on from that and look at a couple players that we actually highlighted in our fantasy previews that I'm proud to say that we brought up and seem to have got right. Anze Kopitar has 7 points, including 3 on the power play, 10 shots, 3 hits, and a block in just his first 2 games. Kris Letang, he has 4 points, including 1 on the power play, 11 hits, 4 blocks, and 3 shots in his first 3 games. Now, I said we mentioned these guys could be targeted about 30 spots ahead of their ADP in their drafts. Are you convinced both of these players could continue to push for elite production the rest of this season, or are you concerned about one of them maybe regressing a little bit?
No, I think I got to eat my words on this one. Looking back at the mock draft 1.0 version that we did, I had them really ranked low in my first draft here, and I got to eat my words on this one. It's a very early sample size that we're seeing, but they both dominated in the first couple of games. Like you said, 7 points in 2 games, 53 fantasy points for Anze Kopitar, and then 4 assists in 3 games for Kris Letang, 34.70 fantasy points for him. I think I got this one wrong. They should have been drafted, like you said, up way higher in the 50s to 60 range. I had them just barely making the top 80, I believe. But like you said, these guys have not missed a step, even though they're on the older side and they're not as young, they're not as fast as they once were. They are still incredible hockey players, and they're still some of the best players in the hockey league right now. So I got to eat my words on this one. They have been incredible so far to start the season.
Well, don't be so hard on yourself, Steele. You might not have had them quite as high as I did, but you still probably had them 15 or 20 spots above most drafters out there. So I'm sure if you wanted to pounce on them in your league, they were probably available at where you had them ranked too. Let's move on to some of the interesting starts by a few teams in the league now, Steele. The Seattle Kraken are a really tough team to judge right now. They went 1-1-1 in the first week of the season. They started with a close 4-3 loss to Vegas in their opener. They won their first game in franchise history in Nashville, and then they dropped a 2-1 overtime loss to Columbus on Saturday. First off, hilarious post on Twitter by the Predators after losing to the Kraken on Thursday, creating a fake banner for giving Seattle their first franchise win, citing that Southern hospitality and welcoming Seattle to the league. So a loss for Nashville on the ice, but a bit of a win off of it there, in my opinion. Now, I mentioned I thought Seattle would be outside the playoffs this season, Steele, and starting their season with a 5-game road trip, it's tough, but they've looked pretty darn good so far. They look better than I expected, at least. What's your first impression?
I think it's about as good as I expected, which is just good. I think, like you said, it's a very early sample size. There wasn't really any high expectations leading into the season for this team to do any sort of, where you could really rate them and how good they were. I haven't really liked what I've seen from Philip Grubauer so far in the first 3 games. I think he's been a little bit soft on pucks. Hasn't really been himself that we saw last year with the Colorado Avalanche. But like I said, it's a very early sample size. He has gotten better in the following games, which is really good to see. So I think that he can continue that kind of streak and get back on track like we saw him last season. But again, I think they're as good as I really expected, which is just very, very solid. I think Seattle being 1-1-1 is a solid start to the season and a lot better than the Winnipeg Jets and Montreal Canadiens have started their seasons.
Well, let's talk about the Montreal Canadiens. Last year's Stanley Cup finalist has the worst record at 0-3 in the league right now and the worst goal differential at -7. Everyone knew they might take a step back this season. We mentioned that Shea Weber, of course, going to miss the year with injury. Jesperi Kotkaniemi taken away by the Carolina Hurricanes. Carey Price kind of blindsided the team a little bit to start the season, not by any fault of his own, of course, but it's not like they were preparing to have to go a month or maybe more without their star goaltender. Is it possible that Montreal is even worse than we thought? I'm talking a bottom 5 team, or do you expect them to rebound?
I'm not quite sure if they're a bottom 5 team in the league, but they have definitely regressed this season. Like you said, it's definitely a tough start with both Carey Price and Shea Weber out of the lineup. It really changes the persona of the Montreal Canadiens. Again, Weber, Price, Kotkaniemi, we can't forget about Philip Deneau as well, leaving the Montreal Canadiens. So all of 4 of those guys are out. They did add some pieces. Did the pieces help a little bit? Sure. But are they better? No. They're not better this season than they were last season because of those 4 key guys being out of the lineup or, again, like you said, being snatched away by the Carolina Hurricanes and LA Kings. So because of that reason, they definitely regressed. I wouldn't go as far as saying a bottom 5 team, but there's a very, very good chance they do not make the playoffs this season.
Steele, you make a great defensive partner, cleaning up all my mistakes. I can't believe I didn't even mention Deneau. And you see what kind of effect he's having on a guy like Anze Kopitar, taking some of those defensive responsibilities away, allowing Kopitar to play a little bit more on the offensive end, not waste so much energy defensively. And it's really shown for Montreal's top line so far. I had Cole Caulfield with about 35 goals this year. not the start I was looking for. I do think they're going to rebound. I don't think Montreal's a bottom 5 team. I think this offense is better than they've shown so far. I think Price is going to be back, and he's going to offer some improvement on that end. But man, this could be a really rough season for Montreal fans to swallow after coming so close in last year's playoffs. Now, 2 teams I expect to compete for the Cup, and you mentioned one of them, the Islanders and Jets, are both winless through 2 games too. So it's still very early for all of these teams. No matter how they've started, there's plenty of hockey left to play. Hell, Columbus and Buffalo are both 2-0, so go figure. Let's wrap this episode up, Steele, with some contract news. Ottawa's Brady Tkachuk signed a 7-year, $57.5 million contract extension. That works out to just over $8.2 million per season. And young Bruins defenseman Charlie McAvoy also signed his big ticket, getting an uncharacteristically large deal from Boston for $76 million over 8 years. That carries a $9.5 million AAV. That's the 4th highest total or yearly total among defensemen in the entire NHL. Steele, I think that Ottawa got it just right. And I actually could have seen Brady Tkachuk potentially getting a higher payday if he held out, just based on what he means to that franchise in Ottawa. He's really the top guy there, and he's the guy they're building everything around. I know Stützle's really exciting. I know that Shabbat's a great player already. He's getting paid a ton of money. But to me, Brady Tkachuk is the guy there. I also think McAvoy is maybe a little bit overpaid. He looks really promising, especially on the offensive end. But for a team in Boston that's so careful with their current and future salary cap, I didn't see him getting the 4th highest AAV among defensemen. Where do you land on these contracts?
Yeah, you're right. I think they did overpay for Charlie McAvoy, maybe just a little bit for Brady Tkachuk as well. But we've seen this over the last couple of seasons that these young guys just starting out the career, they're holding out, they're wanting to get paid before they make the commitment to really being on a rebuild team or being the key centerpiece for the organization. And I actually just read Drew Doughty had some comments for Kirill Kaprizov's contract over there saying, look what you can get if you only play 46 games in the league, and look at the contract that he just got. So again, we're seeing these young guys really hold on, really put their foot down and hold their ground for what they think they deserve. I think Charlie McAvoy was way overpaid on this one. As you said, he's a very promising defenseman for the Boston Bruins. I think Brady Tkachuk's contract was way more warranted, being at 7 years, $57.5 million. But again, I agree with you totally that Brady Tkachuk is the centerpiece for the Ottawa Senators, and they needed to get this deal done so he can get going this season for the Ottawa Senators.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, if a guy's $1 million overpaid and he's your best player or your best defenseman for, 6 or 7 of the next season, you're not going to be too concerned about overpaying him $1 million when you have all those other bargains up and down your lineup. So I do kind of get it from both sides. You want to lock down your players. You might have to overpay them a little bit each year if you want to keep them for 7 or 8 seasons of their prime. Now, not to end on a down note here, but it was reported on Sunday that Jimmy Hayes died with cocaine and fentanyl in his system. His wife was quoted as saying she was shocked. She didn't think it had anything to do with drugs, and that Hayes never showed any signs of a struggle with drugs at home. Folks, if you or anyone you know are struggling with drugs or even a casual drug user, don't be afraid to reach out for help, or at the very least, be informed of what's out there, what the side effects are, what the dangers are of trying some of these drugs, and take advantage of the resources out there. Jimmy Hayes, he had a tragic end to his life, but hopefully he can still have a positive effect on the lives of others and prevent unnecessary tragedies from happening to more families. That's going to do it for today's episode. On behalf of Steele Roden, I'm David Crosby, and thanks for tuning in to NHL Quick Hits.